The fluorescent lights in Ward 7C hummed their eternal monotone as Sarah Mitchell adjusted the IV drip for the man in bed 14. His name was Silas Vance, according to the chart clipped to the foot of his bed. 78 years old, no known relatives, no emergency contact, no visitors in 23 days. The administration had already sent 2 memos about him, cold bureaucratic reminders that beds were scarce and that patients without family advocacy were often the first to be transferred. Transferred, that was the word they used. But Sarah knew what it really meant. Shipped off to Riverside State Facility, a place where the forgotten went to be forgotten further, where the hallways smelled of disinfectant masking decay, where staff rotations were so frequent that no one learned your name. She looked down at Silas. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched thin over prominent cheekbones. A ventilator breathed for him, the rhythmic hiss and click marking time in a room where time had lost all meaning. His hands lay motionless atop the thin hospital blanket, fingers slightly curled, the knuckles swollen with age. There were scars on those hands, old ones, the kind that spoke of labor, of life lived hard. One scar ran from his left thumb to his wrist, a pale line against weathered skin. Another crossed his right palm diagonally. Sarah had seen scars like these before on her grandfather, a man who had worked construction for 40 years. But there was something different about Silas's scars. They were precise, deliberate, as if they had been earned, not merely accumulated. She checked his vitals. Blood pressure stable, heart rate steady, brain activity minimal but present. He was alive, technically. But the doctors had stopped using words like recovery or improvement weeks ago. Now they used words like comfort care and quality of life decisions. And without family to make those decisions, the hospital's ethics committee would soon step in. Sarah had seen it happen before. She had watched patients like Silas vanish from the ward, their beds stripped and remade within hours, as if they had never existed at all. But something about Silas Vance made her pause. Maybe it was the way his jaw was set, even in unconsciousness, as if he was still fighting some invisible battle. Maybe it was the faint lines around his eyes, the kind that came from squinting into harsh sunlight, from years spent outdoors, alert, watchful. Or maybe it was the small tarnished medal she had found tucked into the pocket of his belongings bag, a bronze star, its ribbon faded to a dull purple, its surface scratched and worn. She had held it in her hand for a long moment, feeling its weight, wondering what story it held, before carefully placing it back. Sarah had asked the hospital administrator about Silas's background. The response had been curt. No family, no records beyond admission, probable indigent case. We're doing what we can, but resources are limited. It was the same script they used for everyone who arrived alone, everyone whose life had been reduced to a single manila folder and a bed number. But Sarah refused to let Silas become just another statistic. She had been a nurse for 12 years, long enough to know that every patient had a story, even if no one was left to tell it. And so, she made it her mission to care for him, as if he were her own family. She bathed him gently, careful not to disturb the IV lines. She moistened his lips with a sponge when they grew dry. She played soft music in his room, old jazz standards, the kind her grandfather used to love, hoping that somewhere, deep in the silence of his coma, he might hear it and find comfort. The other nurses noticed. Some of them thought she was wasting her time. "He's not going to wake up, Sarah," one of them said during a shift change. "You're getting too attached." But Sarah didn't care. She had learned long ago that nursing wasn't just about medicine and procedures. It was about dignity. It was about making sure that even in the darkest moments, a person was seen, was valued, was remembered. Tonight, the hospital felt especially quiet. It was late, nearly 11, and the storm outside had driven most visitors home hours ago. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the gaps in the old building's frame. Sarah walked the corridor, checking on her patients, adjusting blankets, administering medications, offering words of reassurance to those who were awake and afraid of the thunder. When she returned to Silas's room, she stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. She wondered if he dreamed. She wondered if, somewhere in the depths of his mind, he was still fighting, still holding on. She was about to leave when she noticed something odd. The corner of his blanket had been folded back, as if someone had been sitting beside the bed, but that was impossible. She had been the only nurse on this wing for the past 4 hours, and no visitors had been cleared through security. She stepped closer, frowning. The chair beside the bed, a standard-issue hospital chair, hard plastic and cold metal, was slightly out of place, angled toward the bed rather than against the wall where she always left it. Her heart quickened. Had someone been here? She glanced around the room, but there was no sign of an intruder, no indication that anything had been disturbed. Still, the unease lingered. She straightened the blanket, repositioned the chair, and made a mental note to check with the front desk. Maybe a visitor had come during the shift change, when the chaos of handoff reports created gaps in oversight. It happened sometimes, but as she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air in the corridor felt different, heavier, as if the building itself were holding its breath. She walked to the nurse's station and logged into the computer, pulling up Silas's file. No updates, no notes from other staff, no record of any visitors. She frowned, drumming her fingers on the desk. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe the long hours and the storm were playing tricks on her mind. She was about to close the file when her eyes caught on a detail she had overlooked before. Under military service, there was a single line. U.S. Army, 1965-1989, honorable discharge. 24 years. That was a career, not just a stint. She clicked on the link, hoping for more information, but the system returned an error message. Access restricted. Contact VA records for details. Restricted. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her curiosity now fully ignited. Why would a veteran's records be restricted? She had worked with plenty of former military patients over the years, and their service records were usually straightforward, accessible. But Silas's file was locked, sealed behind bureaucratic walls that she had no clearance to breach. It was as if someone or something wanted his past to remain hidden. She thought about the bronze star again, the way it had felt in her hand, solid and real. Medals like that weren't given lightly. They were earned through acts of valor, through moments when a person had put their life on the line for something greater than themselves. And yet, here Silas lay, alone and forgotten, his service reduced to a single restricted line in a database. Sarah made a decision. She would find out who Silas Vance really was. She would uncover the story that the hospital's sterile records refused to tell, because if no one else was going to fight for him, she would. The storm outside intensified, the rain now coming down in sheets, the wind rattling the windows with a violence that made the old building groan. Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and returned to her rounds, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over the mystery of the man in bed 14. She didn't know it yet, but the answer she sought was closer than she imagined, written in ink on a page she had yet to see, a name that would change everything. The next morning arrived grey and cold, the storm having passed, but leaving behind a sky heavy with clouds. Sarah's shift had ended at 7, but she lingered, unable to leave without checking on Silas one more time. She found him as she had left him, still silent, suspended in that liminal space between life and death. She touched his hand briefly, a gesture of reassurance, though she wasn't sure if it was meant for him or for herself. As she walked toward the exit, she passed the front desk, where the night receptionist, an older woman named Dolores, was gathering her things to leave. Dolores had worked at the hospital for 30 years and knew its rhythms better than anyone. Sarah paused, an idea forming. "Dolores," she said, leaning against the counter, "did anyone come in last night? Late? Maybe during the storm?" Dolores looked up, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Last night? Let me think." She pulled out the visitor log, a thick binder with pages yellowed at the edges. "We had a few people early in the evening, but after 9 it was dead quiet." "Why?" "I thought I saw signs that someone had been in one of my patients' rooms. Silas Vance, bed 14. Dolores flipped through the pages, her finger tracing down the columns of names and times. Vance, here. Someone did sign in. Around 2:30 in the morning." She squinted at the handwriting. "Looks like..." "Oh." Her expression changed, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. "What?" Sarah leaned closer. "Who was it?" Dolores turned the log toward her, pointing at a signature near the bottom of the page. The handwriting was bold, confident, the letters sharp and precise. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she read the name, General Marcus Hale. She stared at the signature, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. General Marcus Hale. The name was familiar, more than familiar. It was a name that appeared in newspapers, in history books, in documentaries about military strategy and modern warfare. General Hale was a 4-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. military, a man whose career had spanned decades, and whose decisions had shaped the course of conflicts around the world. He was a legend, a figure of almost mythic stature, known for his tactical brilliance and his unwavering dedication to his soldiers, and he had been here, in this hospital, at 2:30 in the morning, to visit Silas Vance. "Are you sure this is real?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dolores nodded. "I wasn't here, but the night guard was. He mentioned it this morning, said a car with government plates pulled up in the middle of the storm. A man in a long coat came in, signed the log, and went straight toward 7C, stayed for about 20 minutes, then left without a word." Sarah's mind raced. Why would a four-star general visit an elderly man in a coma? A man with no family, no records, no apparent connections to anyone of importance. The pieces didn't fit, unless Silas Vance was far more than he appeared to be. She thanked Dolores and hurried back to the ward, her exhaustion forgotten. She needed to see Silas again, needed to look at him with fresh eyes, knowing that someone like General Hale had deemed him worthy of a visit in the dead of night, in the middle of a storm. When she reached his room, she stood in the doorway, studying him as if for the first time. The gaunt face, the scarred hands, the set jaw. What secrets did this man hold? What had he done decades ago that still commanded the respect of one of the most powerful men in the military? She approached the bed and gently lifted his hand, turning it over to examine the scars more closely. They were old, yes, but precise, surgical almost. Not the scars of accidents or mishaps, but of deliberate action. She traced the line on his palm with her fingertip, wondering what tool had made it, what moment in his life had left this permanent mark. "Who are you, Silas?" she whispered. "What did you do?" The ventilator hissed in response, the only sound in the room, but Sarah felt a shift, a sense that she was standing on the edge of something vast and hidden, a story that had been buried for decades and was now beginning to surface. She didn't know how, but she was going to uncover it. For Silas, for the man who had been forgotten by everyone except, it seemed, a four-star general. The days that followed were a blur of routine and obsession. Sarah continued her shifts, caring for her patients with the same diligence she always had, but her thoughts were never far from Silas. She began to research General Marcus Hale, scouring the internet for any information that might connect him to the man in bed 14. She found articles about Hale's career, his deployments, his commendations. She found interviews where he spoke about leadership, about the importance of mentorship, about the soldiers who had shaped him, but nowhere did she find a mention of Silas Vance. She tried a different approach, searching for information about Silas himself, but the restricted records were a dead end, and the few public databases she could access yielded nothing. It was as if Silas had been erased, his past scrubbed clean, leaving behind only the shell of a man in a hospital bed. But Sarah was nothing if not persistent. She reached out to a friend who worked at the VA, asking if there was any way to access Silas's service records. The response was discouraging. If the records are restricted, there's usually a reason. National security, classified operations, that sort of thing. "I can't help you, Sarah. I'm sorry." National security. Classified operations. The word sent a chill down her spine. What had Silas been involved in? What had he done that required his past to be locked away, hidden from view? She was sitting at the nurse's station, lost in thought, when one of the hospital administrators approached her. His name was Mr. Calloway, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual expression of mild irritation. He carried a clipboard, which Sarah had learned was never a good sign. "Nurse Mitchell," he said, his tone clipped. "We need to discuss Mr. Vance." Sarah's stomach tightened. What about him? The ethics committee met this morning. Given his condition and the lack of family involvement, we've made the decision to transfer him to Riverside State Facility by the end of the week. It's the most practical solution. Practical? Sarah stood, her voice rising. He's a human being, not a logistical problem. I understand your attachment, but we have to think about resource allocation. Mr. Vance has been in a coma for nearly a month with no signs of improvement. Riverside is equipped to handle long-term care cases like his. Riverside is a warehouse for people no one cares about, Sarah shot back. You're not transferring him for his benefit. You're doing it because it's cheaper. Mr. Calloway's expression hardened. This isn't up for debate, Nurse Mitchell. The decision has been made. I suggest you focus on your other patients. He turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing there, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to do anything to stop the cold machinery of bureaucracy from grinding Silas into oblivion, but she knew that anger alone wouldn't save him. She needed proof. She needed something that would force the hospital to see Silas as more than just a bed number. And then, an idea struck her: the visitor log. If General Hale had visited once, maybe he had visited before. Maybe there were other names, other clues hidden in the pages of that binder. She waited until her shift ended, then approached Dolores at the front desk. "Can I see the visitor log again?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Dolores hesitated. "Why, is something wrong?" "I just want to check something, please." Dolores sighed and handed over the binder. "Don't take too long. I need to lock it up before I leave." Sarah took the log to a quiet corner and began flipping through the pages, scanning the entries for Ward 7C. Most of the names were familiar, family members of other patients, friends, clergy. But then, buried among the mundane entries, she found it. Another signature dated 3 weeks earlier, just 2 days after Silas had been admitted. The handwriting was the same: General Marcus Hale. He had been here before, twice, and both times he had come in the middle of the night when the hospital was quiet and the chances of being noticed were slim. This wasn't a casual visit. This was deliberate. This was a man who didn't want attention, who was paying his respects in secret. Sarah's heart pounded as she closed the log and returned it to Dolores. She didn't know what it all meant, but she knew one thing for certain: Silas Vance mattered. He mattered enough for a 4-star general to risk exposure, to drive through a storm, to sit in silence beside a man who couldn't even acknowledge his presence. And if Silas mattered to General Hale, then he mattered to Sarah too. She returned to Silas's room one last time before leaving. The evening light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. She stood beside his bed, looking down at him, and made a silent promise. "I won't let them take you," she said softly. "I don't know who you are yet, but I'm going to find out, and I'm going to make sure the world remembers." The ventilator hissed, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw the faintest flicker of movement in Silas's eyelids, but when she leaned closer, he was still as motionless as ever. She touched his hand one more time, then turned and walked out into the corridor, her resolve hardening with every step. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. The week passed in a haze of tension and determination. Sarah continued to care for Silas, but now every moment felt urgent, as if time was slipping through her fingers like sand. The transfer to Riverside was scheduled for Friday afternoon, and despite her protests, the administration refused to budge. She had tried everything, appealing to the ethics committee, contacting social services, even reaching out to local veterans organizations. But without concrete proof of Silas's significance, without family to advocate for him, her efforts were futile. On Thursday evening, Sarah sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a cup of cold coffee and feeling the weight of defeat pressing down on her. She had failed. She had promised Silas that she wouldn't let them take him, and now in less than 24 hours, he would be loaded into an ambulance and driven away, out of her care, out of her reach. She was about to leave when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Dolores. "You need to come to the front desk now." Sarah's pulse quickened. She hurried through the corridors, her mind racing with possibilities. When she reached the front desk, she found Dolores standing with a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped grey hair and a bearing that spoke of military discipline. He wore a dark suit, crisp and formal, and his eyes, sharp, assessing, fixed on Sarah the moment she appeared. "Nurse Mitchell?" he said, his voice deep and measured. "Yes. Who are you?" "Colonel David Brennan, U.S. Army. I'm here on behalf of General Hale." He reached into his jacket and produced a manila envelope. "The general asked me to deliver this to you personally." Sarah took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a letter, typed on official military letterhead, bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. She began to read, her eyes widening with every line. "To whom it may concern, this letter serves as formal notification that Silas Vance, currently under care at Metropolitan General Hospital, is a veteran of the United States Army and a recipient of the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart. His service record, while classified, reflects a career of extraordinary valor and sacrifice. Mr. Vance served as a tactical advisor during some of the most critical operations of the Cold War era, and his contributions to national security cannot be overstated. It has come to my attention that there are plans to transfer Mr. Vance to a state facility. I respectfully request that this transfer be postponed indefinitely and that Mr. Vance be afforded the highest standard of care available. His service to this nation demands nothing less. Should there be any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to contact my office directly. Respectfully, General Marcus Hale, U.S. Army. Sarah looked up at Colonel Brennan, her eyes brimming with tears. He did this for Silas? The general doesn't forget the people who shaped him, Brennan said quietly. Silas Vance was his mentor. Decades ago, when the general was just a captain, Silas taught him everything he knows about strategy, about leadership, about what it means to serve. The general wouldn't be where he is today without him. Sarah's throat tightened. She thought of the man in bed 14, the silent, forgotten figure who had been deemed expendable by the hospital's cold calculus. And now she understood. Silas Vance wasn't just a patient, he was a hero, a man who had given everything, who had shaped the course of history in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged, and who had been left to face his final battle alone. "What do I do with this?" she asked, holding up the letter. "Give it to your administration," Brennan said, "and tell them that if they proceed with the transfer, they'll be answering to the Pentagon." Sarah nodded, clutching the letter to her chest. Thank you so much." Brennan's expression softened. "Thank you, Nurse Mitchell, for caring when no one else did." He turned and walked out into the night, leaving Sarah standing at the front desk, the letter in her hands and a renewed sense of purpose burning in her chest. She didn't waste a moment. She marched straight to Mr. Calloway's office and slapped the letter down on his desk. "Read this," she said, her voice steady and fierce, "and then tell me again that Silas Vance doesn't matter." Mr. Calloway picked up the letter, his expression shifting from annoyance to shock as he read. When he finished, he looked up at Sarah, his face pale. I had no idea." "No one did," Sarah said, "because no one bothered to look. But I did. And now you're going to cancel that transfer, and you're going to make sure that Silas gets the care he deserves. Understood?" Mr. Calloway nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he set the letter down. "I'll inform the committee immediately." "Good." Sarah turned and walked out, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and triumph. She had done it. She had saved him. That night, Sarah returned to Silas's room. The hospital was quiet, the corridors empty. The only sound, the distant hum of machinery and the soft beeping of monitors. She sat in the chair beside his bed, the one that General Hale had sat in, and took Silas's hand in hers. "You're safe now," she whispered. "They're not taking you anywhere. You're going to stay here where you belong." She stayed with him for a long time, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of the ventilator. And as she sat there, she thought about the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, the sacrifices he had made. She thought about the young captain who had learned from him, who had carried his lessons into a career of service and leadership, and who had never forgotten the man who had made it all possible. Silas Vance had given everything, and now in his final days, he was finally being seen, finally being honored, finally being remembered. Sarah leaned back in the chair, exhaustion washing over her, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from knowing you had fought for something that mattered. She closed her eyes just for a moment and let the quiet of the room envelop her. And in that quiet, she could have sworn she felt Silas's hand tighten ever so slightly around hers, a silent acknowledgement, a whisper of gratitude from a man who had spent his life in the shadows and who was now, at last, stepping into the light. The days following the letter's arrival brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of Ward 7C. The transfer order had been cancelled, and Mr. Calloway had issued a memo, terse and bureaucratic, instructing staff that Silas Vance was to receive priority care status. Sarah noticed the change immediately. The doctors who had previously dismissed Silas with clinical detachment now paused at his bedside, reviewing his charts with renewed attention. The nursing staff, who had once viewed him as just another long-term coma case, now handled him with a deference that bordered on reverence. Word had spread, as it always did in hospitals, about the letter from General Hale, about the mysterious veteran in bed 14, whose past was shrouded in classified shadows. But Sarah felt no satisfaction in the hospital's sudden change of heart. Their attention came not from genuine compassion, but from fear. Fear of scandal, fear of military scrutiny, fear of being exposed as the institution that had nearly discarded a decorated war hero. She knew that if not for General Hale's intervention, Silas would already be at Riverside, forgotten and alone, his story buried forever beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference. She continued her vigil at his bedside, spending every spare moment in his room. She read to him from books she brought from home, old novels, poetry, passages from memoirs written by soldiers who had returned from war and tried to make sense of what they had seen. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she read anyway, filling the silence with words, with humanity, with the sound of a voice that cared. On the 5th day after the letter's arrival, Sarah was adjusting Silas's pillows when she noticed something she had missed before. Tucked into the side pocket of his belongings bag, beneath the bronze star, was a small, worn photograph. She carefully extracted it, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned it over. The image was faded, the colors muted by time, but she could still make out the details. It showed 2 men in military fatigues, standing side by side in what appeared to be a jungle clearing. One of them was young, mid-20s perhaps, with a lean face and intense eyes. The other was older, his expression weathered and serious, his posture radiating authority. Sarah's breath caught. The older man was unmistakably Silas, decades younger, but with the same set jaw, the same watchful gaze. And the younger man beside him, his hand resting on Silas's shoulder in a gesture of respect and camaraderie, was someone she recognized from the photographs she had seen online. It was Marcus Hale. Sarah stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. Here was the proof, the tangible connection between the man in the bed and the 4-star general who had visited him in secret. This wasn't just a story of mentorship. This was a bond forged in fire, in the crucible of war, in moments when life and death hung in the balance. She turned the photograph over and found a single line written in faded ink on the back. Cambodia, 1971. The day you saved us all. M.H. Cambodia, 1971. Sarah's knowledge of military history was limited, but she knew enough to understand that 1971 was a time of chaos and secrecy, of operations that were never officially acknowledged, of soldiers who fought in places that didn't exist on any map. And Silas had been there in the thick of it, doing something so significant that a young officer had carried the memory of it for over 50 years. She carefully placed the photograph back in the bag, her hands shaking. She felt as though she were holding a piece of history, a fragment of a story that the world would never fully know, and she felt a renewed determination to honor Silas, to ensure that his final days were marked by dignity and respect, even if the full scope of his service remained classified. That evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave for the night, she was approached by Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of the senior physicians on staff. Dr. Vasquez was a woman in her early 50s, with sharp features and an air of quiet competence. She had been one of the few doctors who had shown genuine concern for Silas from the beginning, and Sarah respected her deeply. "Sarah," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice low, "can we talk? In private?" Sarah nodded, and they stepped into an empty consultation room. Dr. Vasquez closed the door and leaned against the desk, her expression grave. "I've been reviewing Silas's case," she began, "and I need to be honest with you. His condition is deteriorating. The coma is deepening and his organ function is declining. We're doing everything we can, but the reality is that he's dying." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had known, on some level, that this moment was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real, undeniable. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Days, maybe a week. It's hard to say with certainty, but his body is shutting down. I wanted you to know because I know how much you care about him." Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. "Thank you for telling me." Dr. Vasquez reached out and squeezed her shoulder. "You've done something extraordinary for him, Sarah. You've made sure he wasn't alone. That matters more than you know." After Dr. Vasquez left, Sarah stood in the empty room, the weight of the news pressing down on her. She had fought so hard to keep Silas here, to give him the care he deserved, and now she was going to lose him anyway. But she realized, in that moment, that the fight had never been about saving his life. It had been about honoring it, about making sure that his final chapter was written with dignity and compassion. She returned to his room and sat beside his bed, taking his hand in hers. "I don't know if you can hear me, Silas," she said softly, "but I want you to know that you're not alone. You never were. General Hale came to see you. He remembers you. He remembers what you did, and I'm going to make sure that you're remembered too." The ventilator hissed, and the monitors beeped their steady rhythm, and Sarah sat there, holding the hand of a man she had never known in life, but who had become, in these final days, someone she would never forget. The next morning, Sarah arrived for her shift, to find the hospital in a state of controlled chaos. Security personnel were stationed at the entrances to Ward 7C, and a group of men in dark suits stood in the corridor outside Silas's room. Her heart leapt into her throat. Had something happened? Was Silas... She hurried forward, but one of the security guards stepped in front of her. "I'm sorry, ma'am, this area is restricted." "I'm his nurse," Sarah said, her voice rising. "I need to see him." "Let her through," a voice said from behind the guard. Sarah looked up to see Colonel Brennan emerging from Silas's room. He nodded to the guard, who stepped aside. "What's going on?" Sarah demanded. "Is he... He's stable," Brennan said quickly, "but we've received credible intelligence that there may be an attempt to interfere with his care. We're here to ensure his safety." "Interfere? Who would..." "I can't go into details," Brennan said, "but there are people who would prefer that certain aspects of Silas's past remain buried. The general has made it clear that won't happen. We're here to make sure of it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had known that Silas's service was classified, but she hadn't fully grasped the implications. Whatever he had done, whatever secrets he held, there were still forces at work trying to erase him, to ensure that his story never saw the light of day. "Can I see him?" she asked. Brennan nodded. "Of course, but understand that from this point forward, his room will be under constant surveillance, for his protection." Sarah stepped into the room, her eyes immediately going to Silas. He looked the same, still, silent, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator. But the presence of the guards outside, the tension in the air, made everything feel different. This was no longer just a hospital room. It was a fortress, a last line of defense for a man whose life had been spent in the shadows. She sat beside him and took his hand, her mind racing. She thought about the photograph, about Cambodia, about the young officer who had become a general and who had never forgotten the man who had saved him. And she thought about the forces arrayed against Silas, the faceless entities who wanted him erased, forgotten, as if he had never existed. "I won't let them," she whispered. "I promise you, Silas, I won't let them erase you." The hours passed slowly. Sarah went about her duties, but her thoughts were never far from Silas. She checked on him constantly, reassured by the presence of the guards, but unnerved by the implications of their presence. What had Silas done that warranted this level of protection, even now, as he lay dying? If this story touched your heart, click like and subscribe to honor those who served. That afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing medication schedules at the nurses' station, she received a call from the front desk. "There's someone here to see you," Dolores said, her voice tinged with excitement. "You're not going to believe who it is." Sarah's pulse quickened. She hurried to the front desk and stopped dead in her tracks. Standing there, flanked by two aides, was General Marcus Hale. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence commanding even in the sterile environment of the hospital lobby. His uniform was immaculate, the 4 stars on his shoulders gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His face was lined with age and experience, but his eyes, sharp, intelligent, unwavering, held a depth that spoke of decades of leadership and sacrifice. He turned as Sarah approached, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then he extended his hand. "Nurse Mitchell," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I'm General Hale. I believe we have a mutual friend." Sarah shook his hand, her own feeling small and insignificant in his firm grip. "General, I didn't expect..." "I know," he said. "I don't usually make public appearances like this, but I needed to come. I needed to see him one more time." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "He's in Ward 7C. I can take you to him." They walked through the corridors in silence, the general's aides following at a discreet distance. Sarah was acutely aware of the stares from staff and patients alike, the whispers that followed in their wake. But the general seemed oblivious to it all, his focus entirely on the task at hand. When they reached Silas's room, the guards outside snapped to attention. The general acknowledged them with a brief nod, then stepped inside. Sarah followed, watching as he approached the bed. For a long moment he simply stood there, looking down at Silas, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he removed his cap and placed it on the bedside table. He pulled the chair closer and sat down, his movements deliberate and reverent. "Hello, old friend," he said softly. "It's been a long time." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She started to leave, to give them privacy, but the general raised a hand. "Stay," he said. "Please, I think Silas would want you here." She nodded and stood by the door, her hands clasped in front of her. The general reached out and took Silas's hand, his own scarred and weathered, a mirror of the man he had come to see. "I don't know if you can hear me," the general continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need to say this. I need you to know that I never forgot. Not for a single day. You taught me everything, Silas. You taught me how to think, how to lead, how to make the hard choices. You taught me what it means to serve something greater than yourself." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Cambodia. That day in the jungle. We were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. Everyone said we were dead. But you saw a way out. You saw what no one else could see. And you led us through it. You saved 23 lives that day, Silas. 23 men who went home to their families because of you. I was one of them." Sarah's breath caught. She thought of the photograph, of the young officer standing beside Silas, and now she understood. This wasn't just gratitude. This was a debt that could never be repaid, a bond forged in the crucible of survival. "I've spent my entire career trying to live up to the example you set," the general said. "Every decision I've made, every mission I've planned, I've asked myself, what would Silas do? And more often than not, that question has guided me to the right answer." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm sorry I couldn't come sooner. I'm sorry you've been alone, but you're not alone now. And I'm going to make sure that the world knows what you did. I'm going to make sure you're remembered." The room was silent except for the hiss of the ventilator and the soft beeping of the monitors. The general sat there for a long time, holding Silas's hand, his head bowed. And Sarah stood by the door, witnessing a moment of profound humanity, a moment that transcended rank and protocol and the cold machinery of institutions. Finally, the general stood. He placed Silas's hand gently back on the bed, then picked up his cap and held it over his heart. He stood at attention, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the man in the bed, and then, slowly, he saluted. It was a gesture of respect, of honor, of farewell. And in that moment, Sarah understood that this was more than a visit. This was a final goodbye, a last acknowledgement of a bond that had shaped the course of 2 lives, and by extension, the lives of countless others. The general turned and walked toward the door. As he passed Sarah, he paused. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for caring for him, for seeing him when no one else did." "It was an honor," Sarah said, her voice trembling. The general nodded, then stepped out into the corridor. Sarah watched him go, flanked by his aides, his presence commanding the space even as he walked away. And then she turned back to Silas, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just witnessed. She sat in the chair the general had vacated, still warm from his presence, and took Silas's hand once more. "You heard him, didn't you?" she whispered. "You heard what he said. You mattered, Silas. You still matter." The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, and the ventilator hissed. And Sarah sat there, holding the hand of a hero, feeling the enormity of his life pressing down on her, humbling her, inspiring her. The following days were a blur of activity and emotion. The hospital, now fully aware of Silas's significance, spared no effort in his care. Dr. Vasquez personally oversaw his treatment, adjusting medications, monitoring his vitals, doing everything possible to keep him comfortable. But despite their efforts, Silas's condition continued to decline. His breathing grew more labored, his heart rate more erratic. The end was coming and everyone knew it. Sarah spent every moment she could at his bedside. She talked to him, read to him, played music for him. She told him stories about her own life, about her grandfather who had served in World War II, about the patients she had cared for over the years. She wanted him to know that he wasn't just a patient to her. He was a person, a man with a story, a life that had touched others in ways that would never be fully known. On the 7th day after General Hale's visit, Sarah arrived for her shift to find Colonel Brennan waiting outside Silas's room. His expression was somber, and she knew immediately that something had changed. "He's declining rapidly," Brennan said. "Dr. Vasquez says it could be hours." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I need to be with him." "Of course." Brennan stepped aside and Sarah entered the room. Silas looked smaller somehow, as if the life force that had sustained him was finally ebbing away. His breathing was shallow, the ventilator doing most of the work. His face, already gaunt, seemed almost translucent in the dim light. Sarah sat beside him and took his hand, feeling the coolness of his skin, the faint pulse beneath her fingertips. "I'm here, Silas," she said softly. "You're not alone." The hours passed slowly. Sarah sat in silence, her hand wrapped around his, her presence a quiet vigil. She thought about the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, the men he had saved. She thought about the young officer who had become a general, who had carried the memory of Silas's courage for over 50 years. And she thought about the photograph, the faded image of two men standing side by side, bound by something deeper than words. As the afternoon light began to fade, Sarah noticed a change. Silas's breathing, already shallow, became even more irregular. The monitors began to beep more urgently, and Dr. Vasquez entered the room, her expression grave. She checked the monitors, then looked at Sarah and shook her head slightly. "It won't be long now," she said quietly. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. She leaned closer to Silas, her voice breaking as she spoke. "It's okay, Silas. You can let go. You've fought long enough. You've done enough. You can rest now." The room fell silent, except for the labored sound of Silas's breathing. And then, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the window, his breathing slowed, then stopped. The monitors flatlined, their steady beep replaced by a single, continuous tone. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward and checked for a pulse, then gently placed her stethoscope back around her neck. "Time of death, 6:47 p.m., she said softly. Sarah sat there, still holding Silas's hand, tears streaming down her face. She felt a profound sense of loss, but also a deep sense of peace. Silas was gone, but he had not died alone. He had been seen, honored, remembered, and that, she realized, was all anyone could ask for. Dr. Vasquez placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You gave him a gift, Sarah. You gave him dignity. That's something no one can take away." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She stayed with Silas for a long time, holding his hand, saying a silent goodbye to a man she had never known in life, but who had changed her forever. Later that evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave, Colonel Brennan approached her once more. "The general wanted you to have this," he said, handing her an envelope. Sarah opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten letter on official military stationery. "Dear Nurse Mitchell, by the time you read this, Silas will have passed. I want you to know that his death, while a loss, is not a tragedy. He lived a life of purpose, of service, of profound impact, and in his final days, because of you, he was not forgotten. I have arranged for Silas to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. It is the least we can do for a man who gave everything and asked for nothing in return. I am also enclosing a commendation from the Department of Defense, recognizing your exceptional care and advocacy for a veteran in need. Your actions embody the best of what it means to serve others. Thank you, Nurse Mitchell. Thank you for seeing Silas when the world had turned away. Thank you for honoring a hero." With deepest respect, General Marcus Hale Sarah folded the letter carefully, her hands shaking. She looked up at Colonel Brennan, her eyes filled with tears. "Arlington?" "Yes," Brennan said. "The general is personally overseeing the arrangements. Silas will be laid to rest among heroes, where he belongs." Sarah nodded, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. She thought about the man in bed 14, the silent figure who had been deemed expendable by bureaucracy, and who was now being honored by the highest levels of the military. It was a testament to the power of memory, of loyalty, of the bonds forged in the crucible of war. 3 days later, Sarah stood at Arlington National Cemetery, surrounded by a small gathering of military personnel. The sky was overcast, the air cool and still. Silas's casket, draped in an American flag, rested on a platform above the grave. General Hale stood at the front, his uniform immaculate, his expression solemn. Beside him were Colonel Brennan and several other high-ranking officers, all standing at attention. The ceremony was brief, but profound. A chaplain spoke about sacrifice, about service, about the men and women who gave everything for their country. A bugler played taps, the mournful notes echoing across the rows of white headstones. And then, with precise, reverent movements, the honor guard folded the flag and presented it to General Hale. The general held the flag for a moment, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening. Then he turned and walked to where Sarah stood. He extended the flag to her, his voice thick with emotion. "On behalf of a grateful nation," he said, "I present this flag to you in honor of Silas Vance's service and sacrifice. He would have wanted you to have it." Sarah took the flag, her hands trembling, tears streaming down her face. She looked down at the tightly folded triangle of fabric, feeling its weight, its significance. This was more than a flag. It was a symbol of a life lived in service, of battles fought and won, of a man who had been forgotten by the world, but never by those who truly mattered. "Thank you," she whispered. The general nodded, then stepped back and saluted. The honor guard fired a 3-volley salute, the sharp cracks echoing across the cemetery. And as the final shot faded into silence, Sarah stood there, holding the flag, feeling the presence of Silas Vance all around her. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, General Hale approached Sarah once more. "Walk with me," he said. They walked through the rows of headstones, the general's hands clasped behind his back, his gaze distant. "Silas saved my life," he said quietly. "But more than that, he taught me what it means to lead. He taught me that leadership isn't about glory or recognition. It's about making the hard choices, about putting others first, about doing what's right even when no one is watching." He stopped and turned to face her. "You did that, Nurse Mitchell. You did what was right, even when it would have been easier to look away. That's the kind of courage Silas embodied, and that's the kind of courage this world needs more of." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes once more. "I just didn't want him to be alone. And because of you, he wasn't," the general said. "You gave him something precious in his final days. You gave him dignity, you gave him honor, and you gave him a voice when he could no longer speak for himself." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box. "I want you to have this," he said, opening it to reveal the bronze star Sarah had found in Silas's belongings. "It belonged to Silas, but I think he would want you to keep it, as a reminder of the impact one person can have." Sarah took the medal, her fingers closing around it. She felt its weight, its history, its significance. "I'll treasure it," she said. The general nodded. "As will I treasure the memory of the woman who refused to let a hero die forgotten." They stood there for a moment, two people bound by their connection to a man who had lived his life in the shadows, who had given everything and asked for nothing, and who had, in the end, been honored as he deserved. As Sarah walked back to her car, the flag folded carefully in her arms, the bronze star tucked safely in her pocket, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had kept her promise. She had made sure that Silas Vance was remembered, and in doing so, she had discovered something about herself, that the greatest acts of courage are often the quietest, the most unassuming, the ones that no one sees, but that change everything. 2 weeks later, Sarah received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photograph, the same one she had found in Silas's belongings, the image of 2 men standing side by side in a jungle clearing. But now, beneath the photograph, was a brass plaque, engraved with words that took her breath away. "In memory of Silas Vance, mentor, hero, friend, the man who taught us that true leadership is measured not by the battles we win, but by the lives we touch. General Marcus Hale." Sarah hung the photograph in her living room, where she could see it every day. And every time she looked at it, she was reminded of the power of memory, of the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, and of the profound impact one person can have when they choose to care. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. End.